Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Igor Chukarin. I am the instructor for History Jewish Studies 3729. And today it's an immense pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Jennifer Evans. Jennifer Evans is a professor of history at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. And she specializes in the history of contemporary Europe and Germany with interest in transnational histories of sexuality, social memory, and visual culture. She has written numerous articles on the fate of the so-called other victims of the Third Reich, especially their experiences in the aftermath of World War II. She has edited 2 books on same-sex sexuality, specifically and another on the history of documentary photography. Her 2011 monograph, Life Among the Ruins, Cityscape and Sexuality in Cold War Berlin, explored the post-war legacy of Weimar-era decadence in the war-torn and divided former capital. Dr. Evans is currently writing a book on social media and Holocaust memory, conducting research on transnational projects on the role of photography in the sexual revolution, and collaborating with a visual artist on an exhibition into the history of lives of the first generation of LGBTQI scholars to make gay and lesbian and now trans studies a formalized program of study at universities and colleges. Her research has been supported by the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada, the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum, the German Academic Exchange Service, the German Historical Institute, the Humboldt University of Berlin, the Berlin Program of Free University of Berlin, Sciences Po, and the Fondation Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in Paris. And in 2016, Dr. Evans was elected to the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars. So this is a great honor to have her with us today. Before we start, I'll make one announcement, and my colleague Jennifer Hammer will make another one. First, on Thursday, February 22nd, excuse me, and there is a talk entitled Narrating the Righteous in the Colombian Armed Conflict by Professor Colo Tornado, and this is a talk sponsored by the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. We have some flyers here. And I also would like to thank sponsors, the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the Center for Austrian Studies, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the Metropolitan State University. They all made this talk possible, and I'm very grateful to them. Thank you.
Can the tech people hear me? Can you guys hear me with the microphone? Am I on? I need to hold it. Okay. Can you show me? Okay. I can always use a different one. Okay.
Yeah. There we go.
Is that good?
Okay.
All right.
Sorry about that.
All right. Here we go. Thanks so much for the welcome, and thanks to the students for coming. Usually in Ottawa, I often thank my students when they come through snow, because even though it's a part of our collective experience, it's always wonderful to see people make their way despite the weather. I actually just gave a version of this lecture in Ottawa last week to my students. I teach a history of populism, authoritarianism, and fascism class, and so it will be interesting to see how you respond and what your questions will be. This is an area of research that has changed a lot over the last 15 years. When I first started doing research into the subject, there was very little known about the experience of gays and lesbians outside of the fact that we knew that they wore the pink triangle in the camps. And in fact, the story of their experience is one that's still unfolding as we're still conducting research. So what you hear today will be very different in 10 or 15 years when we get even more rich material. So history is great, for that. It's always evolving, it's always changing. So I was asked to come and give you a little bit of a background into the specifics about this particular victim group, or these victims groups, and I want to put it in a couple of different contexts. I'm going to go back into the 19th century a little bit at one point, but I'm also going to talk about the not so recent, not so distant past. In July 2004, so not that long ago, this article was splashed across what we might call the boulevard press, the yellow press, the Bild-Zeitung. I don't know what an equivalent, it's not really the National Enquirer because it doesn't invent stories, but it's considered a pretty lowbrow press. And it says, Wie schwul ist Deutschland? How queer or how gay is Germany? And it was relating, it was related directly to the leader of the Federal Liberal Party, Guido Westerwelle, who had just come out in a public event with his male partner. How gay is Germany? 2004. Now, this is a really interesting phenomenon. It was July, so it's considered a lull point in the German press cycle. And the more highbrow newspaper, the Süddeutsche Zeitung, kind of like the New York Times, wrote a story saying, what's up with this? What's up with this story? It seems pretty crass. But at the same time that they wrote about this Bild story, how gay is Germany, they also alternated between sort of being a little kind of lurid themselves and being serious. What does this tell us? It tells us that there was some discomfort still in 2004 about the suggestion that a political leader might be effeminate, and his effeminacy, by being gay, might disqualify him from leading a political party, maybe even one day leading the country. The stability of the nation was really at stake in 2004. Well, another magazine picked up on the story, Titanic, and it's more of a satirical magazine, in 2009. And this is an interesting moment because at this point, Guido Westerwelle is no longer just the leader of the Liberal Party. He's in a coalition government with the Angela Merkel, with the CDU. So the question is, wird der nächste Kanzler eine Frau? Will the next chancellor be a woman? This is an interesting image, because this is already the 21st century. And for a country like Germany that had gone through the turmoil of the 20th century, it's hard to imagine that this kind of image would be in the public sphere. I think it's an interesting one because it shows you how important still this link between masculinity, between sexuality, effeminacy, and the strength of the nation still was in a place like Germany. And it was important because it had deep roots. And these roots went back to the 19th century. And they help us understand why gay men especially were targeted by Hitler and the Third Reich as a danger to the people's community, as a danger to the Volksgemeinschaft. So I want to do a little bit of this prehistory and then take us into the 1930s and 40s, where I understand that you are right now in your lecture cycle. So the 19th century was really fixated on the creation of a new man, of a new form of masculinity that could weather the challenge of democracy, of industrial capitalism, of all the changes that were going on throughout Europe. And this was a German problem, but this was also a European phenomenon. And it sounds funny to talk about the evils of democracy, right? Because we don't think of democracy as bad. But for a lot of Europeans, democracy and the changes brought about by democracy really destabilized the world that they had known. It meant Jewish emancipation. It meant that Jews no longer had to be confined to certain kinds of jobs. It meant that they could actually expand their social presence. It meant women's emancipation. More women by the turn to the 20th century were allowed to vote. It changed the way that the traditional family functioned. And of course, a lot of people saw the sexual and racial mixing of classes and of people as linked to this massive set of changes that was sweeping through Europe. In the 1960s, when historians were trying to figure out how fascism happened in Italy and in Germany, one historian asked us to start looking at the kind of cultural history of the 19th and early 20th century. And that was George Mossy, who taught not here but at the University of Wisconsin, and helped establish the kind of cultural history of fascism as an entry point into understanding the regime. He wanted us, or encouraged historians, to think about the Third Reich's anti-modernism, the way that it positioned itself as against these great changes from the 19th century. That fascism included a kind of anti-feminist component, and that it was anti-bourgeois, that it saw the middle classes as also suspect. Democracy and modernity brought with them all of these great ills, new social formations that really challenged traditional society. Mossy wanted us to think about fascism as a cultural revolution, and he quotes, "An effort to develop a new ideology and culture and to create a revolutionary new man in place of the materialist, pragmatic, and liberal culture of the 19th century." He argued that fascism couldn't just be seen in negative terms, as just reactionary or anti-communist, but that it satisfied a need for a lot of Europeans, for a lot of Germans, a need for activism combined with identity that would embody this new society that they were hoping to build. Well, why do I go into the 19th century to understand the 1930s? Because it's a foundation for things to come. So if we look at the kind of anti-Semitism that's connected to this creation of the new man, we see that depictions of Jews in the 19th century drew on this idea of effeminacy. They were often depicted as the dandy. And on the left slide, you see an image from 1804 of a Jew looking into his mirror, sort of, looking at himself through his mirror. And you see as well in the other slide over here, a depiction of the UK Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, who was Jewish and who was responsible for wide sweeping reforms allowing trade union activism. And he too is depicted as a soft, effeminate dandy. So the new man was in counterpoint to this Jewish effeminate stereotype from the 19th century, a product of democratization. Well, the German Empire, of course, really emphasized these links between sexuality and power and strength of the nation. And we see that in everything, the iconography, the militarism, the uniforms. It was a common trope in the 19th century in Germany that the state was primarily a man's domain. In the German Empire, a strong state was the symbol of all authority and a healthy German masculinity. What's the opposite? The opposite is the danger of a degenerate, sexually abnormal, racially deviant, feminized citizenry, and in this case, a feminized masculinity. There was the sense by 1900 that masculinity was in crisis. There was labor unrest and the growth of the social democratic movement. There were ideas, there was the experience of economic depression. Even the working man lost whatever status he had managed to attain. There were fears of degeneration, fears of racial mixing, fears that women entering into the public sphere, getting jobs, being educated, was going to change the status quo. And so what was needed was a preservation of hierarchies, a preservation of biological difference, a preservation of race difference as the natural order of things. So it's not hard in this context to imagine that homosexuality would be the perfect counterpoint to this new man, to this new masculinity. And indeed, homosexuality and the homosexual was an embodiment of the opposite, the other ideal. So sodomy, same-sex acts between men had been punished in the Holy Roman Empire, But upon its disillusionment in 1806, this fell from the books because, of course, there's no longer a Holy Roman Empire to speak of. Same-sex acts between men remains criminalized in Prussia, and as you know from your class, Prussia is the dominant state behind unification, and isn't it interesting that it's the Prussian version of the law code, especially pertaining to homosexuality, that becomes the law for the German lands. So homosexuality is outlawed in Germany upon unification in 1871, and it's understood as paragraph 175 of the Penal Code. So this number, this name will come back over and over again in lecture. Well, so the unification of Germany in 1871 and this new law code created a kind of a public discourse around homosexuality. It added to the fears that the new man was in peril. But it also, interestingly, created a context for an early gay rights movement. And we don't only just have one vision of homosexuality, we actually have three different visions of homosexuality. And I'm going to talk about them a little bit because they're interesting in and of themselves, but they're also interesting in terms of what's to come. So three different takes, let's say, on homosexuality and how to understand same-sex acts between men. Three different visions of the masculinity associated with gay sexuality. And it's worth spelling them out because they are so interesting. There was one organization called the Community of Special Individuals, which sounds better in German than it does in English. The English translation sounds kind of strange. The Gemeinschaft der Eigenen, which coalesced around the writer and publisher Adolf Brandt and his friend and colleague Benedikt Friedlander. It was founded in 1903, and it claimed to foster the highest values of masculinity within the nation. It proclaimed itself, and it proclaimed a joyful sense of masculinity for the good and the progress of the state and the culture. This was a masculinist vision of masculinity. This was everything that the Scientific Humanitarian Committee under Magnus Hirschfeld was not. The masculinists believed in a society of men, in virility, in strength, and this was their vision for homosexuality. It was completely polar opposite to Magnus Hirschfeld's vision. Hirschfeld was a German Jewish doctor and eventually would establish the Institute for Sexual Research, one of the first places that the Nazis burned books and pamphlets when they came to power in 1933. His vision of homosexuality was that it was a third sex. It represented a deviation from the norms, that there were feminine men, there were masculine women, this was completely biologically acceptable, and that should form the basis of decriminalizing homosexuality. Now you can see already that that's a very different vision than the one of the masculinists. It's one that admits that effeminacy occurs in nature and it's nothing to worry about. The third group is organized around the Wandervogel movement, the wandering birds. It doesn't sound so great in English, but it sounds better in German. A bunch of youth groups from the turn of the century that believed in going back to the land, in camaraderie, in singing and hiking, kind of like the Boy Scouts, which taught self-discipline, which taught honor. This third group came out of the Wandervogel movement and is personified by someone like Hans Blüher, who advocated for a kind of a folkish nationalism, a Germanic nationalism, that was about all of these social values, all of these values of self-discipline, of adventure, and of a strong masculinity. So here's just a picture of the Wandervogel movement. What do you notice already when you look at an image like this? You start to see the growth of uniforms, right? And I don't know if anyone is a Boy Scout or a Girl Scout. I was a Girl Scout. We call them Girl Guides in Canada. I was a Girl Guide leader because I have children and they wanted to be Girl Guides, so then I had to be a Girl Guide leader at one point. So yes, the uniform is still a feature of many different youth groups. The Fogle Movement began incorporating military drill and style, sort of giving you a sense of a change afoot. There were a number of people within the Fogle movement who identified as these sort of harder core masculinist homosexuals. And they enjoyed being in these organizations because they liked being in the company of men. And indeed, they also liked the intergenerational part of being in these groups. Hitler would ultimately outlaw the Fogle movement in 1929. Any idea why? Why would he outlaw this group? Aside from what I just said about the intergenerational part, why else do you think? Yeah. Completely. It's a parallel organization, and you want to have your organization at the helm. You might be curious about whether or not there were Jewish members of the Fogle group. There were different Jewish groups. Many of them were more Zionist-oriented groups that also espoused this idea of a strong masculinity. Well, let's warp ahead a few decades. So you've studied the Weimar Republic. You know that Germany declared its first Republican government in the final days of World War I. You know that the Kaiser abdicated and fled to Spa. You know that in this period, there was great unrest in the early years, so much so that it's called the Weimar Republic and not the Berlin Republic, although sometimes it's called the Berlin Republic. But it's called the Weimar Republic for a reason, because they literally had to move government for a time outside of Berlin because it was too under siege. The Weimar Republic is this great and interesting and smoldering fire. We see, of course, all sorts of differences of political opinion, but we also see massive social and cultural changes as well. This period is referred to as the Weimar Republic until roughly 1933, as you know, Hitler comes to power. It's in this context of the 1920s, as the political situation is worsening, that we start to see more and more armed militias on the right and the left, doing battle in the streets, donning uniforms, and again, redefining masculinity for their own purposes. But you know too that the Weimar period is also the period of sexual experimentation. If anyone's watching Babylon Berlin on Netflix, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't watched it, you should watch it because it's a really great series that speaks to this period. The Weimar Republic was a period of great social and cultural change and a flourishing of alternative sexualities, especially in places like Berlin. Not everywhere. Not every city was as open-minded as Berlin, so there are regional differences. And Berlin, a place like Berlin, becomes a space, a city where we see a recognizable gay but also a lesbian identity, perhaps for the first time in German history. It gains mass visibility, and it gets a reasonable level of acceptance. German women had been allowed political participation since about 1908, and there was a strong women's movement, especially in the city. Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Research and his Scientific Humanitarian Committee supported many of the local lesbian initiatives. So, and you can see in this one slide, he lends his name to what is basically like, they call it in German a Stadtführer, a kind of a guide. You come to Berlin, you want to know where the lesbian bars are, you buy the lesbian bar guide, and it's endorsed by Magnus Hirschfeld because it's part of his sort of worldview of normalizing alternative sexualities. There are tons of lesbian bars in Weimar Berlin. There are magazines published, newspapers. There are bars like Dorian Gray on Bülowstrasse, which was one of the oldest and better known homosexual establishments. It was a mixed club. It had gay as well as straight visitors. It had an elite day on Fridays. It had dancing with different stages. Weimar is great in terms of bar culture. There's often all these really different stages and spaces. There was one bar in Berlin that had a swimming pool with a movable floor. It's quite off the scale. In this bar, the food was Austrian. It had a Viennese atmosphere and was purported to be of traditional but also good quality. It also was claimed that the male clientele at Dorian Gray was to some extent limited, but every Wednesday there was sadomasochist night so that it drew in crowds of all different shapes and sizes. As one sign read above the lesbian bar, Topkeller Club, which was visited by actresses and the literati, "We are the new spirit. We do it with brazenness." Well, so what does this tell you? It tells you that there was an incredible visibility for alternative sexuality, that homosexuality and homosexual rights were not just envisioned, though, as a political responsibility or about respectability or about blending in, that it was about, in some cases, very in-your-face and very troubling for some people, vision of the world. It was about sexual choice, and it was also deeply, deeply unconventional. Well, it's not hard then to see how Hitler could appeal to tradition to try to correct these excesses. And as you'll see in a few seconds, of course, he's not alone in this. That in fact, there are many different groups that struggled with this vision of homosexuality, this brazenness. It didn't go over with everyone. And Hitler's idea of a Volksgemeinschaft, or a people's community, was definitely perceived as an antidote to perversion. So Hitler's particular vision after 1933 was to highlight the perils of modernity. So modernity, urbanization, industrialization had brought all of these ills to Germany. For some people, this is what made Germany interesting, and for others, this was about a loosening of social mores. Race thinking obviously guided how the Nazis treated social outsiders and how they thought about their vision of the new man. It's inseparable. Just like those images of the dandy as the Jew really are inseparable. The Nazis would use a mix of legal reform, of policing, of welfare measures, of medical knowledge to enforce hierarchies of belonging and citizenship. And this thinking was deeply gendered. It was racialized. Gender, nonconformity, and effeminacy were understood as biologically aberrant, that they were a threat to the social and political strength of the community and the state. So let's make some of that look a little bit more familiar with some examples. So the Nazi new man, this is a really great, what I love about this statue, this is Arno Breker. He was a professor of visual arts in Berlin, and he was Hitler's favorite sculptor. And what's really great about this image, and the poem that goes along with it about the sacrifice of mothers and losing their sons to the war, the First World War. But what's great about this image is that it has a bit of a tension, right? On the one hand, you've got these incredibly ripped, muscular men, kind of scary looking in the way they're rendered. But then you also have a slight homoeroticism, right? And some scholars have pointed to the clasped hands in front of the genitals. It's an interesting tension. Strength, virility, power, and being in the company of men and honoring the company of men. This tension will be a part of the regime going forward. The National Socialists imagine themselves as creating a revolutionary movement, another vision of the new man with core and intrinsic values. What do you think those values are from what you've done already in class? What are some of the values for this new Nazi masculinity? What do you think? Give me some things that come to mind. What kinds of values? What's the value system? Yeah.
Emphasis on taking action, like direct action.
Perfect. Direct action. What else? What do you think? The poem gives you an idea of some of the ideas. What about honor? or sacrifice, or self-discipline, or dedication, and above all else, comradeship, right? Of sacrificing for your brother. These ideas were not just Nazi creations. These ideas, of course, transcended the political spectrum. They were part of conservative and monarchist groups, and they were even part of the communist paramilitary organizations. They had an appeal that was widespread and that transcended left and right. And in some level, this maybe explains their tenacity as well. There are different masculinities within National Socialism. And it's hard for us maybe to see the differences between, say, an Ernst Röhm and a Heinrich Himmler. But there were huge differences between the SA and the SS, especially in the early years. The SA was formed primarily at first it was about sort of a educational instruction of young pro-Nazi adherents. And then they were primarily known as street fighters, as sort of brawny bullies. And of course, that's embodied in someone like Ernst Röhm on the right, who does not possess a Monsieur. That's not a scar from dueling. That's, of course, an injury in World War I. The SS, the Schutzstaffel, Heinrich Himmler's, which he oversaw, had a different masculinity in its conception. This was the masculinity of an elite. This was to be the masculinity of those that would guard the concentration camps, and this would be the masculinity of those who would serve as part of the Einsatzgruppen in the East. And of course, the fact that Ernst Röhm himself was a homosexual who aspired to this hard, virile masculinity of the masculinists brings back that tension between homoeroticism, male bonding, and a kind of a harder masculinity. Of course, when Röhm is purged along with the SA, part of the reason was because the SA represented, a threat to Hitler's prestige, especially vis-a-vis the army, but it also represented the dangers of Röhm's homosexuality, especially as the regime needed to build more and more institutions of men, the Wehrmacht, the Labor Corps, the Hitler Youth, and you couldn't have the specter of same-sex desire within these institutions. So it becomes logical to purge the regime. Now, I said that not all sort of masculinists came from the fascist side of the spectrum, and here's a great example of the Reichsbanner, the Imperial banner, black, red, gold, which was the largest pro-democracy organization during the Weimar Republic, kind of affiliated with the Social Democratic Party. Again, donning uniforms, military precision. This is also a part of the masculinity that the age of unrest birthed, in a sense. And on the left-hand side of the spectrum, with the Rotkämpferbund and Ernst Thälmann, the leader of the Communist Party's paramilitary organization. A similar reverence for uniforms, but maybe you notice that these are different uniforms. Anyone want to tell us a little bit about these uniforms and where the inspiration comes from for these? Anyone recognize the outfit at all? Yeah.
The caps look more like worker caps, like my industrial caps, kind of representing labor union, labor working, what they stand for in a broad sense.
For sure. And the tunics themselves? Do they look Germanic or German? Do they look like anything that came from, think of your Imperial German sort of imagery, or did they come from they came from the Soviet Union, so it's modeled after the Russian tunic. And in World War II, especially Russian soldiers would wear a tunic that's sort of peasant-y inspired. And so this belief in sort of militarism, of discipline, is something that we see all across the political spectrum. By 1934 and 1935, it starts to take even more shape. And if there was time, I'd show you pieces of Triumph of the Will, because everybody has to watch this film at some point in their life, and maybe you saw it in class already, and you will. There's two scenes in Triumph of the Will that are so fabulous. There's so many that are. It's considered the first modern propaganda film. It's directed by a former actress who made a name for herself doing Alpine movies in the 1920s, Leni Riefenstahl. And what's really great about the film, too, is that it surveys the Nazi Party Congress in Nuremberg, 3 or 4 days, where members of the party would come and they'd have their torchlight processions and all the rest. But what's really great about this propaganda film is that it's an embodiment of Nazi ideals. So when you watch it, as you will, you're going to see everything that you expect to see from Nazism. But what you don't realize is that this is the product of a failed effort the year before, when Riefenstahl was meant to film the party congress, and she didn't get it quite right. They didn't really come off in the way that they had wanted to. What this tells us is that Nazi propaganda, like the regime, is something that is evolving. It's not something that just imposes its view. It's actually something that is moving and taking shape. In Triumph of the Will, there are two scenes that are really great for illustrating my argument. One is the day before the torchlight procession, where all of these young men, various ages, there's young boys that are hammering on drums, there are members of the Reich Labor Corps, they're all setting up camp, and they're basically washing each other. So there's frivolous, sort of silly music in the background. They're washing each other, they're playing games, they're making food for the event. It's this really great and strange and bizarre vision of masculinity. On the one hand, it looks like they're just there having a good time, so it's not the image you normally have of Nazism. But it also shows an intimacy, washing each other's backs, shaving each other, an intimacy that, of course, men would have experienced in World War I, living cheek by jowl in the trenches in these awful, awful times. And it also, of course, again, speaks to this tension about what perhaps could happen when men are brought together. The second scene is a much more orderly scene of members of the Reichslabor Corps sounding off the different places in the regime where they're from. And you there see this kind of order and perfection. You see the image of the Aryan that we all come to expect. These values of manliness, of intimacy, of sacrifice, of comradeship, but also of tenderness will be important to the Nazis because you need to have this kind of emotional support when waging acts of genocide. And my colleague Thomas Kuhne wrote a book about comradeship that really does explore the softer emotional side to masculinity as being important, especially in making these awful, awful crimes palatable or doable. But that doesn't mean that those values were embraced. Those values were trumped by the harder masculinity that I've outlined. It was so enthralling that someone like Albrecht Becker, himself gay, willingly enlisted for the Wehrmacht because he wanted to be among men. So this tells you the appeal of a certain masculinity, of a being together with brothers. And for the Nazis, this would soon pose challenges and problems. So already in 1933, when Hitler comes to power, we start to see a backlash and a crackdown on the more public and obvious expressions of homosexuality. So all of those clubs in Berlin are shuttered by 1935-36. Many of the magazines and newspapers that were in circulation were removed from public consumption. Some of them had been actually taken out of circulation already in 1928, so it wasn't just the Nazis, but by 1933, the deliberate campaign against homosexuality was definitely on order. By 1935, and I hear you have looked at the Nuremberg laws, and you've looked at how 1934-35 is this really interesting period in the Third Reich where Hitler is consolidating power, where he's effectively redrawing the administrative boundaries of the state, where he's orchestrating Gleichschaltung, coordination. And it's in this moment that we see the reform of the penal code, with paragraph 175 strengthened so that it can encapsulate more and more and more activities. So in the 1920s, if you were a gay man and you were in Berlin and you were perhaps in a gay bar, you were not open for up for scrutiny. If you happened to go home with someone and something happened and your neighbors knew about that, nothing would transpire. They had very strict rules of evidence that they would use before laying a charge. But in 1935, this goes out the window. And suddenly gossip and innuendo is enough justification for the Gestapo to actually start investigating people. And that's a major change. And it also leads to waves and waves of denunciations of average Germans taking the opportunity to point the finger at neighbors, perhaps over disputes that had nothing to do with their sexuality. But this gave a justification to use the apparatus of the state. Once men were brought in for interrogation, there was often brutality because they wanted to get as many names of other potential homosexuals. A change in the law which allowed the Nazis to keep people without charge in protective custody allowed them to hold someone and to interrogate them until they got what they had wanted. Ultimately, from 1933 to 1945, there were about 100,000 arrests for paragraph 175. There were 50,000 prosecutions, and we think between 5,000 and 15,000 deaths related to time in the camps. What's interesting about these numbers, on the one hand, it's a much smaller sample than the experience of other victims of the Holocaust. On the other, it represents interrogations at the hands of Germans themselves. What's interesting about gay men's experiences is that they could easily have 1 and 2 and 3 charges on the books. They could be arrested, tried, and jailed for a year, released for a couple of months, they reoffended, they go back into prison, they're released, they reoffended. This is a very different experience than the experience especially of Jewish Germans and Jewish Europeans, right? Who are sent directly to the camps where most of them perish. So it's a different experience. Here's just some pictures of the clampdown, the crackdown with some of these clubs. The ones on the left is students marching by the Institute for Sexual Research, Magnus Hirschfeld's institute. And I think what's an interesting part of the story is that these are students at the Humboldt University, right? These are, the future generation. These are, in a way, right? This is us. This is the university reacting to the politics of the day. And on the right-hand side is the famous club El Dorado, which was closed and made into an SA party headquarters. This is just an image of paragraph 175 and the penal code reform. And these are just a couple of mugshots from the late 30s and an excerpt from one of the investigatory notes from the Geheime Staatspolizei, from the Gestapo. And what's interesting about this is that when you read it, if you can read the German, it says this person that they are following is an unverbesserlicher Homosexueller, is an incorrigible homosexual. And he has fallen himself into, these difficult times. In this case, he was trying to supposedly seduce a younger man. In January 1937, the SS had arrested over 230 men in the city of Lübeck in the north, under this Nazi revised criminal paragraph of 175, which outlawed homosexuality. And in that action, in that moment, Friedrich Powell von Grotzheim was arrested. And this is a picture of him. He was imprisoned for 10 months. The Nazis, in his own words, had been using paragraph 175 as grounds for making mass arrests of homosexuals in the scene. In 1938, He says in his memoirs, "I was rearrested, humiliated, and tortured. The Nazis finally released me, but only on the condition that I agree to be castrated." So this was an option for homosexuals if they wanted to avoid further persecution. He was arrested again in 1943 under suspicion of being a monarchist and not for his homosexuality. And it was on that charge that he was sent to Neuengamme concentration camp as a political prisoner. So you see from this example that the experience of gay men could be quite varied, quite different than other victims groups. It doesn't mean that it's better, it means that it's a different apparatus, a different logic at work for gay men. Walter Grune's story is also interesting to this end. He studied with the Bauhaus in the 1920s under the celebrated artist Paul Klee. He was caught in a series of denunciations in 1934 and arrested with 70 other men. Under interrogation, he admitted to being gay, and he was held in protective custody for 5 months. He was allowed to return to his childhood home on the German-Danish border, and he stood for trial in violating paragraph 175 at a later date. In September 1936, he was convicted and sentenced to prison for 1 year and 3 months, minus the time already served in protective custody. Later, he was sent to Flossenburg and to Sachsenhausen, and he was there until those camps were liberated in 1945. So when I first started doing research on these files, it was always very strange to me. It's very strange to see the logic at work in dealing with these men, that there was a very intricate and very careful logic, that there is indeed a Nazi jurisprudence, that there was great care and precision in dealing with these people. And that is just to say that it's a much more complicated story than I think we actually understand. Of course, when these men made their way to the jails or prisons or work details, but especially the concentration camps, they wore the pink triangle. And here's just a list of all the various triangles that people could wear. Triangles for being regular criminals, black triangles for asocial women, green triangles for habitual criminals, and a lot of homosexuals were actually under the green triangle as habitual criminals if they'd offended multiple times in the 1920s. So if you are a researcher and you're going to do research on homosexuality and you're only looking for the pink triangle victims, you miss all of the gay men who were actually categorized under the green triangle. In the prisons, of course, their experience was harsh and grueling and deadly. And we know the story of concentration camp life, probably through visual culture, through films, through movies, and through other victims groups. But what we don't appreciate is that gay victims were considered to be at the very bottom of the ladder. And so even within prisoner society, there were hierarchies such that the stories, the memoirs that surfaced in the post-war period of gay men often had this aspect of their lives edited out. Alternatively, many gay men chose not to tell family members after 45 because of the shame that they internalized for being gay victims of the Holocaust. And many of the other victims in the camps treated them as though they deserved to be there because they were legitimate criminals as opposed to the real victims of the regime. So what does this tell us? It tells us that prisoner society is a brutal society, and of course the Nazis bear great responsibility for that, but not total responsibility, because homophobia existed before the Nazis came to power. This is just an example of the quarry in Flossenburg when gay victims were sent to the camps within Germany, because most of them, at least from the German Reich, experienced the camps in Germany proper. Some were sent on to Auschwitz, but most of them were in the German and the Dutch and the French camps. They were sentenced to hard labor, so they worked in quarries, they created bricks at Sachsenhausen camp. And the death toll in these spaces and places was extreme. Well, you notice that I've talked exclusively about gay men, even though I used the image at the very beginning of lesbians and lesbian bars. Well, what about the women? What about women's experiences? Lesbianism was not persecuted under paragraph 175. It was not illegal to be in love with other women. Paragraph 175 did not apply to women. Lesbianism was not criminalized. But there was great hostility towards women within general society, especially for women who failed to conform to these ideals of femininity that you know probably very well. After 1933, women did get ensnared in the camp system, but often for different reasons. So some wore the black triangle as asocials, women who refused to work, women who refused to have children, women who refused to adhere to these feminine stereotypes that you know very well. There was a great fear that women might endanger the regime and endanger the strength of the state, but ultimately even jurists who were considering whether or not to criminalize lesbianism in 1935 felt that women weren't as much of a threat as gay men. Anyone have any idea, using the Nazi logic, why women would be less of a threat to the state than gay men? What do you think? What would motivate them not to act and not to criminalize women? What might come to mind? Mm-hmm.
Men were the only ones who could really hold positions of leadership or political power, and so they'd be a lot more concerned about men corrupting the values of like the leadership than they would be women.
For sure. So it's only natural, right? Because these are the positions that men hold. They hold a natural status that's above women's. Why else, though? Why else do you think? Yeah.
In order to continue the Aryan race, the perfect woman would be seen as a vessel for giving birth.
For sure. And literally the jurists in 1935 believed that, unlike men who struggle with arousal, a woman could always be forced to bear children. So it's as blunt as that and as unpalatable as that. Women were less important, women's positions were less serious, and ultimately a woman could be forced to perform her duty to the state. And men, because they held much more of a privileged position, in a sense, their privileged position was their undoing. Well, this idea that homosexuality wasted a man's reproductive strengths, but that a woman could be potentially made to serve the country, was definitely reason why lesbianism was not criminalized. But it doesn't mean that women weren't identified as lesbians and didn't experience the state backlash too. And we have a really interesting case of Instutska, who was not arrested because of paragraph 175, and ultimately didn't even catch the eye of the Gestapo because of her lesbianism, but because she helped a Jewish woman try to escape through the Swiss border and was caught. And interestingly, upon interrogation, they found that in her hometown of Würzburg, a number of the local neighbors had laid charges, had raised the issue of her mannishness, of her inability to conform to gender norms, and their urging of the police to investigate her because something must not be right. So if we're doing the history of gay and lesbian persecution, and we only follow the trail of police and court cases for paragraph 175, we'll never find women's experiences. But instead, when we want to find how women, and potentially women who identified as lesbians, when we want to find out their experience, we have to look in different places and spaces, and we have to look for gender nonconformity. Well, only a few more minutes, so I'm going to just mention a few things and talk a little bit about the post-war period, and then we'll have time for some questions. So when I first started doing research on this subject, we didn't even think about trans history, identity, or anything. It was just not an issue that we historians or scholars even really preoccupied ourselves with. And that is a really interesting thing, because what it tells us is that the kinds of questions that we ask of the past evolve in tandem with the kinds of issues that we deal with in our everyday. So a number of German activists and scholars went back to the archive in search of trans and transsexuality in history. And you can imagine they didn't find 10 or 15 or 20,000 cases. They've really only found 2, 3, 4, 5 cases at best. But it's so important to mention trans experience because it too is different from gay men's and lesbians' experiences. And it speaks to the strangeness of the Nazi regime. So trans and transsexuality is so little understood historically in general, and in this period especially. In the 1920s, people who identified themselves as transsexual, that meant that they went to perhaps Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science in search of information and help. Perhaps they wanted surgery, and there are early surgeries and endocrinal therapies that are done in the 20s and 30s. If they were deemed to be a true transsexual, meeting the criteria of the day, they were actually given an identification card. And they used that identification card if they were stopped by police for dressing as a man or dressing as a woman, because that was seen as wrong. So they could show their transsexuality card, and it says Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld is, they're in the care of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, and then they were allowed to go about their business. So it was quasi-tolerated within those circumstances. But transvesticism, of course, was outlawed by the Nazis for all the reasons I've just outlined. But their experience, at least the research suggests, is maybe a little bit more complicated. We only have a few cases, but they're worth mentioning. In some instances, we know of a case where someone was institutionalized as a schizophrenic, where in care they said that they were transsexual, that they willingly underwent castration, and they were willing to undergo further surgeries in order to live their lives as the woman that they felt themselves to be. How did the regime treat this particular case? Interestingly enough, after some education in a sort of a state-sponsored motherhood facility, this person who took the name Tony was allowed to foster a child. So complicated, but what it tells us is that for the Nazis, indeterminacy, being in between, was a danger, and being a homosexual was a danger. But as long as someone made the transition from one to the other fully, then they were to be accepted as the male or the female that they claimed themselves to be. So it's a bit of a conundrum. There are only few of these cases on the books, and many students are actually now doing this research to find out more and more about their experiences. But it raises an interesting question, the question of the oddness of Nazi rule. So what happens in the post-war period? And this is where I'll just bring us up to date very quickly. You'd think that this law, paragraph 175, would be a glaring example of Nazi crimes and of Nazi legal and medical misdoing. But in actuality, when the Allies occupied Germany, the English, the French, the Russians, and the British, and they scoured the books to look at the penal code, the criminal code, they ultimately determined that paragraph 175 had already been outlawed. Homosexuality had already been outlawed before the Nazis came to power. So it was, in a sense, a German thing. So we can't tamper with German, real and true German laws. So they allowed, at least in West Germany, for paragraph 175 to stay on the books. Initially, the Nazi law was on the books until the 1950s. Nazi files, Nazi cases, Nazi interrogations were used as evidence against men in the 1940s and 50s to prove their guilt. And in the post-war period, the same number of investigations took place with the same number of prosecutions, roughly, as had happened under the Nazis. So from 45 to 69, when it was repealed in West Germany, the same number of men fell into police custody as had under the Nazi regime, begging the question of what had really changed. In East Germany, they had adopted a much more liberal vision of the law, and this was an interesting difference. The Chancellor of West Germany, Konrad Adenauer, even said on record in the late 50s, concerning male homosexuality, the legal system must, more than in other areas, erect a bulwark against the spreading of this vice, which otherwise would represent a serious danger for a healthy and natural life of the people. So what do you hear here? You hear race, sexuality, you hear degeneracy, the same language that had been at work in the 19th century and into the Nazi period. Well, after 1968 and 69, when the laws are decriminalized, although they stay on the books, even in West Germany with a slightly altered form, it's not until the 80s, 90s, and 2000s that we actually see a sea change in how people view the issue. And we start to see the evolution of monuments and memorials to gay victims. The one in Berlin, the bottom right, is perhaps best known, but there was an effort by lesbians to lay a kind of commemorative orb in Ravensbrück prison as well. There's been an official apology by the regime. Men were exonerated for their Nazi infractions, but unfortunately it took some years before Germany actually realized that it had perhaps something to speak to the 1950s and 60s continuation of illegality for gay men. What's the balance sheet in all of this? More men and more women were welcomed as full citizens with the decriminalization of homosexuality and efforts to commemorate past crimes. There were struggles between the different victims groups. Lesbians and gay men did not completely see the issue of persecution in the same way. And if you come to my talk this evening, you'll hear a little bit more about that. Gender remained a divide in terms of how we think about persecution. And obviously this issue of race, of degeneracy, of the strength and virility of a healthy masculinity remained a core feature of political life into the 2000s. So what does this tell us? It tells us that we are getting there, but perhaps there is still much more work to be done. Thank you.